Even if you don't know very much about geography, I'm pretty sure you know that the Pacific Ocean lies to the west of the Atlantic Ocean. Except, what's the best way to get from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean? You'd think it's obvious, wouldn't it? You go west. Actually, you don't. The best route from the Atlantic to the Pacific is to follow the route of the Panama Canal, and you can see the route on the map, and you will see that if you do it, you end up in the Pacific Ocean 30 miles to the east of where you started off in the Atlantic. Suppose you want to fire a rocket to Mercury. Mercury at the shortest distance is about 50 million miles away from Earth. That sounds a lot, but actually it's not that far as rockets go. So you'd fire a rocket directly towards Mercury. Well, no, you wouldn't. NASA, the American Space Agency, set a vehicle in motion in 2004 to get to Mercury from Earth. You can see on that slide what it did. It circled the Earth once, it circled Venus twice, it circled Mercury 3 times before NASA managed to nudge it into orbit around Mercury. And there's a reason for that. If you actually fire a rocket straight towards Mercury, it either hits Mercury or it passes it by and goes off somewhere into infinite space, and in either case, it's not much use to you. That's why it took 7 years, and actually, although the shortest distance from Earth to Mercury is only 50 million miles, that shuttle actually traveled 5 billion miles, 100 times as far, in going from Earth to Mercury. How you use the Panama Canal, how you get to Mercury from Earth, these are examples of obliquity. They're problems for which the best solution turns out to be an indirect way of achieving it. But I'm not a geographer, and I'm not a space scientist either. I didn't come to thinking about obliquity by thinking about these issues. I came to it by thinking about economics and business. And that goes right back to the 1990s, where I was noticing the change that had actually occurred in business. And that change was exemplified for me in these 2 extracts from the mission statement, the statement of objectives of what was then Britain's largest chemical company, ICI. ICI had been Britain's leading industrial company for most of the 20th century. And what it said about itself was it aims to be the world's leading chemical company, serving customers internationally through the responsible application of chemistry and related science. Through achievement of that aim, it says, we will achieve these other goals, making money for shareholders, satisfying our employees, etc. Like a lot of businesses, in the 1990s, they changed it. It became our objective is to maximize value for our shareholders by focusing on businesses where we've market leadership, a technological edge, and a world competitive cost base. Well, actually, we know what the outcome of that was. The company that went to maximize value for its shareholders, it did it for a rather short period. The share price reached a peak in 1997, and ICI is not only not the world's leading chemical company anymore, it doesn't actually exist anymore. What was left of it was taken over in 2007 by a Dutch company. Actually, the direct was less effective than the oblique, even in achieving the direct aims. And that's been true relatively generally. Bear Stearns, the American investment bank, which went bust in 2008, had a sign over its trading floor that said, "We make nothing but money." And the end result for the business that made nothing but money was that in the long run, they didn't make very much even of that. That's what brought me to the idea of obliquity, that our complex goals are often best achieved indirectly. And the phrase obliquity actually came to me when I talked to the chemist who was more than anyone responsible for the modern success of ICI. In fact, he was behind the development of 3 of Britain's large pharmaceutical companies that have made this a world-leading British industry. He was called Sir James Black, and he discovered a variety of blockbuster drugs, and in the process of doing that probably made more money for shareholders than anyone else in the history of British business. I asked him why he had left ICI to join another chemical company and another pharmaceutical company for whom he also discovered a blockbuster drug. And he said to me, it was easy. That the management of ICI wanted me to go on a road shows to sell beta blockers. I wanted to find more drugs. And he laughed and said, I used to tell my colleagues that if they wanted to make a lot of money, there were easier ways of doing it, drug research. And he shook his head and said, how wrong could I have been? I think of it now, he said, as the principle of obliquity. Complex goals are often best achieved when you're not trying to achieve them. And that was true in his career, and it's true in business more widely. Now, this isn't an idea that applies only to business, nor is it a new idea. One of the best statements of obliquity I've found comes from the 19th century philosopher, John Stuart Mill, who wrote a great deal about utilitarianism. He was one of the great utilitarians, emphasizing that the pursuit of happiness was the fundamental human objective. Despite that, he wasn't actually a very happy man. And towards the end of his life, in his autobiography, he wrote, I now thought that this end was only to be attained by not making it the direct end. Those only are happy who have their minds fixed on object other than their own happiness. And I think we all of us know that that's true. So it's not just true in business, it's not just true in space, and it's not just true in geography. The direct approach has really been was represented in the 20th century by what was called modernism in a whole variety of areas of human activity. And one of the great examples of modernism was architecture. The French architect Le Corbusier wrote, "A house is a machine for living in." And in order to make houses that were machines for living in, he built in the outskirts of Marseille the first tower blocks. They were called the Unité d'Habitation, and they were copied, as you know, all over the world. But houses aren't machines for living in. Houses involve complex social interactions to work effectively, and the people who built buildings like that didn't actually understand these interactions. If you want to look for great buildings in France, you don't go to Marseille to see that. You go to Paris to see this, to see something like the Cathedral of Notre Dame. It took 2 centuries to build, and when they started off building it, nobody knew what it was going to look like when they finished up. We don't actually know who the architects and builders who put it together actually were, and yet they built something that has endured for 7 centuries and will no doubt endure for 7 centuries more. That's obliquity. But why? Isn't it obvious that the way we should think about achieving things is to define our goals and go for them? You'll find 100 self-help books that will tell you that. The first problem is that defining what our objectives are is actually quite complicated. The United Nations created something called the Human Development Index, which is their attempt to define what it is countries should be aiming at. And you can see on the top of this slide the formula for the Human Development Index. It's pretty easy. All you need to do is write down, is to find L, which is life expectancy at birth. You need the adult literacy rate, R. You need the proportion of the population in secondary education. You need GDP per head at purchasing power parity, and you shove them into that equation, and you get the Human Development Index. Well, but why? And why couldn't you have some other formula? And if you put the numbers into that formula, you discover that Canada and Norway tend to come top. Of course Canada and Norway come top. If Canada and Norway didn't come top, you wouldn't think, gosh, I must have made a mistake, and what I think about Canada and Norway is wrong. What you would think would be there must be something wrong with the index, or something wrong with the data that I put into it. We're telling the formula what the answer is, not the formula telling us what the answer is. Our objectives are complicated, and we learn through the process of working them through what they actually are. That's the first reason why we need obliquity. The second reason is that the world is inevitably uncertain. I find it's not very popular to quote Donald Rumsfeld much on these sort of occasions, and this is one of the many quotations in his days as Defense Secretary for which he is much mocked, but it's actually a very helpful quotation, because what Rumsfeld does in that is to distinguish the known unknowns, by which he means the things you know you don't know, from the unknowns, the things you don't know you don't know. The known unknowns are things like whether a coin will fall heads or tails. We know it will be either heads or tails. Our unknown is just whether it will be heads or tails. But you can't, as it were, predict the invention of the wheel, because if you could predict the invention of the wheel, you have already invented the wheel. There is a whole lot about the future world which we actually don't know and can't know. So the world isn't just risky, the world is uncertain. There are a whole variety of things, not only that we don't know, but we don't even know what they might be. Next reason why we need obliquity is that the world is complicated, and the simplifications we make to try and deal with it are very often misleading. My first job I had was working in Oxford. And when I worked in Oxford, some friends who lived in London invited me to dinner at their house in Hyde Park Gardens. And as you do, I asked them, what's the nearest underground station to your house in Hyde Park Gardens? And they told me Lancaster Gate. So I took the train to Paddington, got out at Paddington, looked at the tube map, and I discovered it's easy to get from Paddington to Lancaster Gate. You just go 2 stations on the Circle line, change at Notting Hill Gate, and 2 stations on the Central line to Lancaster Gate. There probably aren't many people in this audience who know London well, because I have a sense that a lot of you don't know what the denouement to this story is going to be. Because if you look at a map of London that is an overground map, you will see what I did, which was I went 1.5 miles east, 1.5 miles west on the Circle line from Paddington to Notting Hill, changed trains, and retraced the 1.5 miles back west on the Central line. It's actually less than 500 yards to walk from Paddington to Lancaster Gate. Now you might think, so that means the tube map's a terrible model. But it's not a terrible model. It's actually a brilliant model. It was designed in the 1930s by a circuit wiring engineer called Harry Beck. It was immediately adopted because people found it so easy to use. It's been imitated all around the world, and it's helped tens of millions of people find their way to their destination. It's just a bad map for that particular problem. But how do we know that it's a bad map for that particular problem? The only way we know it's a bad model for that particular problem is if you have the more generalized knowledge of London that I now have, but I didn't have then. That is, there isn't a right model, a true model, that we can use to analyze complicated situations. There's only the right model for any particular problem, and there's no objective way of determining what the right model for any particular problem is. But we have this idea that this isn't how we should be making decisions. Benjamin Franklin, the great American polymath, wrote a letter to the English chemist Joseph Priestley, in which he set out how you ought to make decisions. Take, he said, half a sheet of paper, divide it by a line into 2 columns, and write the pros on one and the cons on the other, and see what the lists look like. And Charles Darwin actually followed Franklin's advice. Darwin was trying to decide whether he ought to get married or not. So he took a sheet of paper and he divided it into 2 columns, one headed marry and the other headed not marry. So this was the pros column for marry. A friend who will feel interested one. An object to be beloved and played with, better than a dog, anyhow, he said. The charms of music and female chit-chat. That was the advantage of being married. Not married seemed to have a rather longer list of benefits. The problems of being married, for example, not being forced to visit relatives, to bend in every trifle, to have the expense and anxiety of children, forced to gain one's bread, bad for one's health. Perhaps my wife won't like London. But as Franklin told him, he thought about it for a few days. And then you can still find this paper in the Darwin archives. He wrote at the bottom of the marry column, "My God, it is intolerable to think of spending one's whole life like a neuter bee, working, doing nothing after all. No, won't do. Living all one's days solitary. Only picture yourself a nice soft wife on a sofa with a good fire." Which led to the conclusion scribbled across the bottom of the paper, marry, 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 QED. He thought he ought to follow Franklin's rule, but in the end he didn't. As a matter of fact, this assessment seems to have been made without any particular woman in mind. But the following year, he did in fact marry Emma Wedgwood, and the couple seemed to be happy enough at any rate to have 10 children. Actually, what Darwin was playing, and Franklin, I think, had his tongue in his cheek when he wrote that in the first place. Franklin also wrote what I call Franklin's Gambit. He said, so convenient a thing it is it to be a reasonable creature, since it enables one to find or make a reason for everything one has a mind to do. And that is what Darwin did, and that is what we are doing all the time when we make personnel assessments or risk evaluations or whatever it is we may be doing. We're finding ways of rationalizing decisions which we've already made on other grounds. And actually in Iraq, in risk assessment in banks, that is a very large part of what went wrong. People were actually playing Franklin's Gambit. So we need to make decisions obliquely. Above all, we need to be foxes rather than hedgehogs. That's a distinction that's been around in personality types for a couple of thousand years. In the 20th century, it was popularized by Isaiah Berlin. The hedgehog knows one big thing. The fox is eclectic and pragmatic and knows a great many little things. We don't have single, overarching, directed goals that we can push our thinking towards. We actually learn about our goals through the process of trying to accomplish them. We live in a world that is characterized by extreme uncertainty. We try and deal with the complexity of the world by building models and structures to deal with them, but there isn't any right model that gives us the right way of making decisions about the complex problems we face. If we're to make decisions successfully in complex environments, obliquity has to be a major element in the process by which we do it. Thank you all.